What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 234. I'm the co-host, Kyle Anzalone. Co-host today is Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well. And it looks like we survived Invasion Day, Connor. And this was a huge dud. No Russian invasion of Ukraine as predicted by the U.S. war state. So we'll be breaking down what's actually going on in Ukraine, the tensions, the diplomacy, the troop movements, all the important stuff. So this is going to be a great show that we have today. Also, Connor's got an update on the Iran deal, and there is some pretty interesting rhetoric and maybe pretty positive rhetoric on that. So maybe some good news to go along with the hawkish news on the Ukraine issue. Everybody share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, where me and Connor put out a ton of content. Not only the show, but we also have both been writing there. I've been putting out articles both in the featured articles section and as my news roundup. So definitely check those out and share them if you like them. Also subscribe to the show, like, share, all that. Wherever you're listening, particularly if it's one of the video platforms, YouTube, Rumble, or Odyssey. Also, you can follow the show so you get everything on our social media pages, Facebook and Twitter. Then you could support the show financially by donating, Patreon, Subscribestar, and crypto. All that information right there in the show notes page. And also the information for our sponsor, Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. The promo code is peace. Now I do have an update, and it's a little bit of a downside. It is now a 20% discount when you use that promo code, but the show continues to get the same kickback, so you're still supporting the show to the same amount, although your discount is just a little bit less. But I just want to make sure everybody knows that and to be very upfront. But yeah, they still have a great selection of products at Paloma Verde. I know they're coming out with some new products, but Connor, tell me about your favorite products.
Mine are the soft gels. Take them after meals. Always feel much better than I did before if I don't take them. Great for concentration, anxiety, anything. If you're gonna go for a run, you're gonna do leg day or some workouts you're doing, you're gonna recover faster. And then the tinctures are just absolutely the best because it's like the strongest concentration you can get, and I think the highest quantity as well. Like if you buy one of the larger tinctures that they have, I mean, it'll last you a long time. Plus they come in like really cool flavors. Like I think the mint one is probably my favorite. And then always the gummy bears, which are just delicious and super fast acting. So there's a lot of good stuff to check out. And I have given CBD to Paloma Verde CBD to my dog, and she loved it.
All right. PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. Connor, let's get into the show, and I'm going to start off today with an update on the lackluster invasion day. And we now have Press Secretary Jen Psaki, a true believer, coming out for the Biden administration and saying, well, it wasn't necessarily going to be the 16th, and we still think we're in the, window of a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine. But it does seem like that was a noticeable step back from how certain they appeared to be in the past that there was going to be a Russian invasion. So I really didn't think that the invasion was going to come on the 16th, Connor. On the show, I think we've continued to, and this I think was kind of the nuance that me and Scott got into on the last show. That look, there is a potential military confrontation to come in Eastern Europe because of the expansionist, aggressive American and NATO policies. However, neither of us thought, and I still continue to think that that's really not imminent in the word of within the next 2 to 3 weeks or month. And so you have conflicting reports now of actually what's going on the ground in and around Ukraine, Connor, with the U.S. on the 14th. This was Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby saying that, hey, look, we think that Russia is moving more troops into the region, and occasionally I'm seeing what I'm guessing are different defense apparatuses, parts of the Pentagon, things like that, leaking various claims of some of these troop movements and satellite imagery to the media. The reports are now saying 130,000, Connor, but as far as I could tell, that's the 100,000 that they had always been saying, and then the 30,000 troops that Russia said would be in Belarus between February 10th and 20th for a round of war games. And so, I'm not sure how much of a buildup we really have to worry about now. The U.S. had talked about 175,000 troops was a number where once Russia got there, they would pull the trigger. We're still 40,000, troops short of that. And so I guess it seems interesting that the U.S. is so sure that there's going to be an invasion right now. But Russia said yesterday, Connor, that they're actually going to be moving troops out of the Crimea region and returning some troops, I think, to the bases in Dagestan and other areas of Russia. But, I'm not exactly sure that that's happening. And so, that's what Russia is saying. Could be true, could not be true. It's worth noting that this time it's not just the Americans and NATO head Jens Stoltenberg came out and said, hey, NATO doesn't see anything to say that Russia is pulling back troops, but also Ukraine said that as well. And, of the actors in the region who have, given and shared intelligence, Ukraine has not always been necessarily the most hawkish. So I do think it's notable that they're agreeing with the U.S. and NATO that is not happening. So, Connor, as far as I could tell, there's no, particular Russian troop movement that would suggest either a de-escalation or escalation, but continuing to watch this and try to get some confirmation on which direction these troops are actually going. Now, there are, looking at being some more NATO troop movements. We had the announcement that there's potentially going to be the deployment of, I think, 1,000 troops to 4 different NATO states. That would be Bulgaria, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. Now, interesting, Connor, at least 3 of these states in the past have said that they don't want any more NATO forces, although, they have said they want them as well. But recently, Hungary and Bulgaria have definitely made those statements. Romania as well. Slovakia, on the other hand, actually accepted $100 million from the U.S. for the U.S. to upgrade to military bases in Slovakia that they're using. So if troops end up there, I would be a little bit less surprised than in those other 2 countries. The U.S. is also continuing on the rhetoric and claims that there is going to be a false flag committed by Russia in Ukraine in order to justify Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This, seemed to be the claim of an actual, I guess, false flag, not a fake false flag as the State Department had suggested, but the White House has been saying this for a couple months now. Still no evidence, no reason to believe it, but it is pretty aggressive rhetoric. Also had this story here, Connor, that I think is pretty important, and that is Israel torpedoed the sale of Iron Dome interceptors to Ukraine. I guess this is enough of a joint Israel-U.S. project that Israel would have to say over who these interceptors get exported to. And because of the relationship that Israel maintains with Russia and Ukraine, it didn't want to upset Russia by facilitating the sale of these interceptors to Ukraine. Now, this did come only from Israeli sources, and so I'm not sure what the Americans are going to say about this if they ever say anything about it. But I do think it's worth noting a case of the U.S. looking to move interceptors into Ukraine. Of course, these aren't as serious as if they put the Patriot missile systems in there. Now, one really important story that came out in the past couple of days, Connor, is that the sanctions package that NATO is putting together will not include cutting Russia off from SWIFT. And so that's the international banking system. And, I would guess that would be more of a blow to the Russian economy than, the other sanctions probably. And so this does seem pretty significant. And while we don't know all the sanctions that the NATO countries are willing to put on Russia, my increasing guess is that it doesn't go as far as the Americans would like us to believe. And I'm really curious how much the Germans would go along with cutting off Russia from the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Now, speaking of that pipeline, there's been 2 new bills introduced in the House and the Senate by the Republicans, and these are Republican-only bills. There's been talk over the last probably 2 or 3 months now, Connor, maybe last month to 2 months, of a joint bill put together by the Foreign Affairs Committee, I think of the Senate, that would be Menendez and Risch and all those guys. That was going to be a pretty heavy sanctions bill targeting Russia, but there, I guess, is enough disagreements that wasn't getting done, or at least not fast enough. And so Republicans have introduced their own bill. And this bill does target the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Apparently, they're looking at preventing any construction on the pipeline. Now, maybe that pipeline is completed, Connor. There are some reports of that. I'm not sure. I know it's not operating. And so I guess there are questions. And my other guess is that even if it was completed, it's going to need like pretty standard and routine maintenance on different things. And so sanctions that target the construction center of the Nord Stream, and pipeline and all of this could, I guess, maybe shut down maintenance on the pipeline and prevent it from, remaining operational. And then if Russia were to invade, it would impose direct sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which says that if Germany refuses to close it, we're going to sanction our NATO allies, the German economy. That's what they're talking about when they're talking about sanctioning the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. As I highlighted in my article for the Institute today, Connor, that I titled here, how much will Biden's Ukraine policy cost Americans? Biden, in a speech yesterday, came out and said, look, this is going to be a problem whenever we introduce these sanctions. It's going to hurt the American energy sector. Now, Biden did say that he was taking preemptive measures to try to alleviate any pressure on the American energy sector, but Connor, that sounds to me more like an excuse for cronyism than anything else. All right, now there is some diplomatic things going on that are important. The first is the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK made a statement that said Ukraine could be flexible on the issue of future NATO membership, but then that was walked back, and I believe not only by the ambassador but also by the leadership of the Ukrainian government. And I believe Zelensky said that's the president of Ukraine, that Ukraine still plans to join NATO. And so this is really important because, a statement from Ukraine saying we no longer want to join NATO could be very key in relieving the tensions going on in Eastern Europe. Now, despite the fact that Americans are saying an invasion will happen, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov is pretty firm that diplomacy could still happen, and he is making public statements urging Putin to continue to go in the diplomatic direction. Putin, for his part, is saying that Russia doesn't want war and is looking to continue negotiations. One thing that I think is being left out of the entire mainstream conversation, I haven't heard this mentioned in any real mainstream articles, Connor, other than maybe one mention in a Newsweek piece, actually, was that Russia still hasn't returned the response to the proposal that the U.S. and NATO put towards the letter that Russia put out. And so my guess is that Russia will probably respond to that proposal before any kind of military conflict breaks out. Now, one important thing going on politically in Russia is that the Duma, that's the Russian legislator, passed a resolution of sorts. I guess it called on kind of Putin to at least weigh in on the possibility of recognizing the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine as an independent Donbas state. I believe the Kremlin has come out and said that they're not going to do do this. But there is an interesting article out today on Gilbert Datro's website where he lays out the case where, this could be a step that Putin takes that does show, some real step, but at the same time comes far short of anything that's going to require Russian troops or a conflict with Ukraine. So just a couple more stories, Connor, before I let you weigh in on the Russia issue. Russian bombers flew and challenged the U.S. occupied airspace in Syria. This was around the Deir al-Zor region of Syria along the Euphrates River. Apparently, it wasn't like a major issue that the Russian bombers and other cargo planes that flew into the issue were escorted away with a fighter jet from the U.S. and its anti-ISIS or anti-Iranian coalition partners that are in Syria. And then the last thing is, I probably should have mentioned this before, but Secretary of State Antony Blinken has warned Russia against recognizing the breakaway regions as independent from Ukraine, which, I'm not sure if that would be a short-term move by Russia, but I do think Gilbert Datro's piece is worth reading on why that could be something Russia will do. Going back to my article real quick, Connor, there was a announcement from an official announcement put into the Associated Press by the U.S. intelligence community that said the website Zero Hedge, which, I don't want to just crap on Zero Hedge or anything like that. They reprint a lot of important stuff there. At the same time, like anywhere, click on the links. You got to do a little bit of vetting, and I don't know, I do a lot more vetting while I'm on Zero Hedge than antiwar.com, but we all have our personal preferences and things like that. And they do reprint like David Stottman's Contra Corner, or they used to at least. So, there's a lot of good stuff on there. And the fact that the intelligence agency is telling the AP that the conservative financial news website with a significant American readership is amplifying Kremlin propaganda, it's extremely disturbing, Connor. And as I wrap up my piece here, I say the new White House effort for narrative control is eerily similar to George Bush dictating either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. If rhetoric is any indication, the fear of a Russian invasion will cost Americans a lot more than just tax dollars. And so, Connor, Invasion Day turned out to be a huge dud, but I will go ahead and let you weigh in and say what you want to say about what you think the current situation between the U.S. and Russia over Ukraine is.
Yeah. First of all, I'll just say that the Zero Hedge thing is just ridiculous. And I think they said one of the reasons why they accused him is because they were printing articles from the Strategic Culture Foundation, which has previously been accused of being, a Russian propaganda outlet by the U.S. as well. And this is just more. I think that as we saw recently with Dave Smith on the Rogan podcast talking about Yemen, the people are hungry for independent media and people who tell them the truth about foreign policy, and it means a hell of a lot to people. And so, this is just a continuation. Like you actually said on the Action for Assange show last night, I believe, or you connected it to Proper Night and what we saw in like early 2017 with the Hamilton 68 dashboard, where, if I remember correctly, they were naming sites like Consortium News and antiwar.com and the Ron Paul Institute as probably something not too dissimilar from amplifying Kremlin propaganda or something like that, or helping Trump or Hillary lose, let's say. But so that's pretty transparent. But I will say this about the Zelensky thing. Zelensky's been, the Ukrainians are obviously still seem to be a very moderating influence relatively to what they were previously all throughout last year, I'd say, for the most part. They turned around once they saw what this all did to their economy, driving their currency to its, lowest value in years. Since I believe 2015, when the worst part of the war was still going on in the wake of Victoria Nuland's coup. But when he qualified that statement, which I thought was really interesting, when the ambassador said that if it helps to reduce tensions or avoid a conflict, we don't have to necessarily join NATO, or we can rescind our desire. We don't really have to push that. When Zelensky came out, I believe it was in the press conference with Olaf Scholz recently. I think Dave quotes it in that one of those pieces that he said something along the lines of, well, it's kind of like a dream. I think he says, how far are we, really going to go with this? And the part I do remember him explicitly saying is that, and who's going to support us anyway? Which is very interesting that he said that alongside the new German chancellor, who, obviously the French and the Germans are against this and have been for more than a decade, since the Bush administration and the Bucharest summit. And so, and then Olaf Scholz said that he goes, this isn't even on our agenda. So he goes, he kind of turned it around on the Russians a little bit. He goes, I don't know why they're making such a big stink, so to speak, about something that isn't even being considered at the moment. But that's another good signal to Putin and I think even Zelensky, because he kind of, especially after his joke about on the 16th, if that's when they're going to invade, it'll be a day of unity, and we'll just hoist up what do you say, blue and yellow banners, and we'll show solidarity. They're really kind of, I mean, as you've pointed out, there people are starting to invest in Ukraine and Russia again. The Russian stock market has been up, so there's obviously, I think they're realizing the diminishing returns of pushing this hostile policy. At the same time, I think I just saw that NATO, at this defense ministerial meeting with NATO, that Stoltenberg and Austin are announcing that they're developing plans to establish new battle groups in southeastern, Eastern Europe and Central Europe, and that they're, to enhance their deterrence and their ability to, fight a conflict in Europe. But for what it's worth, Colonel Douglas Macgregor recently said that there were some briefings held with, I believe, with the Biden principals that really scared the hell out of them, and they've come to realize that they just do not have the ability to fight a war in Eastern Europe. That it was made clear that Russia has this integrated air defense from the Gulf of Finland to the Black Sea, and that they can deny virtually any threat in the region. And we knew that it was, to some extent, when they brought the S-400s into the theater, that all this, what was going on all last year, because after the pandemic, NATO and the Russia hawks were all saying, I think in Stars and Stripes, that, because of, the pandemic and COVID, we weren't able to have as many warships in the Black Sea as we would have liked to. We only were there for 82 days out of the year, which would be akin to having Russian warships in the Gulf of Mexico for 82 days out of the year. But they were like, well, we would like to step that up. So they did 182 days last year with warships in the Black Sea. And obviously you had bombers and spy planes and all these, myriad drills, the biggest drills held since the Cold War, all throughout last year. So I think they jumped the shark, basically, because Putin at this point now has called their bluff to a large extent. And as you talked about with Scott, they're just sending these kind of token deployments, 1,000 troops here, 3,000 troops here, 1,000 troops there. And but it's a joke. I mean, it's on its face, it's a joke. It's not a real deterrent. And if anything, it's just a way of gracefully, I think, backing down. Biden said I believe it was recently at the press conference, that he made it clear that NATO and the U.S. don't have missiles. He's talking about what you've talked about, the Patriot missiles and the offensive strike weapons in Ukraine, and they have no intention of doing so. Now, he's saying that publicly, because previously it was more like Ray McGovern would do his Kremlinology and look at the statements from the Russians, where they would say, Biden made this clear on the December 30th phone call. But now that Biden is saying that publicly, I think that's, also a good sign. Putin saying that, there are, and Lavrov, that there are some substantive things we can discuss, particularly in the U.S. proposal or the response to our security proposals about missile placement, transparency, meaning like military exercises, and restoring the INF treaty. And that's what they're talking about most, I feel like, right now, from what I've seen. And so that's all to the good, but all this kind of NATO posturing, if they really do try and over time, build a significant deterrent, which, as McGregor points out, they really don't have in Europe. It would take them too long to move. They don't have the air defenses. They don't have enough ground troops to fight a war with Russia, nor do their NATO allies. So it would take a long time to do that, and just even moving anything, even a fraction of the forces that it would take to do that would be, a huge escalation. And basically it would, that might encourage the Russians to make a move against Ukraine, which they probably aren't contemplating at this point anyway, as we've said. So I think we're just in a very unique moment where it appears that things are moving ahead, but there are so many forces as you talk about in Congress who are trying to sabotage it. And with all these different sanctions bills and all these things, and if they want to go after Nord Stream 2, like you said, something like that could end up breaking up NATO, especially if they're talking about imposing these things. We hear more and more, and we have been for a while now. And even the Ukrainians were saying this previously. I don't know how recently they've said it, but it's certainly in the early months of this crisis, since November. You had Zelensky, I think, even saying that, why wait? Why wait to put the sanctions on now? Then we have no deterrent if we don't, impose those sanctions now, which is obviously entirely untrue. I mean, the only real deterrent America has at this point is the threat of, and even that is not as strong as they think, because they can always turn to China and all these other sanctioned countries and develop a parallel economic system, which they're no doubt working on. But if they do that now, they would blow their whole wad, and it would be a huge mistake. So I just we'll have to see, mostly, I think, if the Russians do in fact pull troops back from Crimea, if we get confirmation about that from these these bases that are closer to Ukraine and Western Russia, and what happens particularly after the Belarus drills. But I think that also domestically, this has been a huge mistake for the Biden administration, because they're going to get, if they do make the right decisions here in diplomacy with Russia and really do engage in substantive talks, you could see already that the Congress is going to try and subvert that, and the NATO establishment will as well, because it poses a threat. If Russia is no longer this horrible boogeyman that never attacked and that actually engaged in these discussions to embark on some serious arms control agreements and lead to peace, and if that pipeline does get wave through the regulatory approval process in Germany, you're going to start to see a real reduction in the ability to paint the Russians as this major threat that has to be, that it would justify all this extra, all this brinksmanship and all this more money and all these military deployments and all these, weapons sales that continue to go on. But I think that we're just seeing mostly just an end to the era when NATO could just basically do whatever it wanted. And I am starting to also wonder when something like this is going to happen with China, because as Ray McGovern talks about a lot, and Ted Snyder, that the Xi Jinping is almost in the room or on the calls when he's talking with Biden. To some extent, he's just invisible, because now it's been made very clear repeatedly, especially after this joint statement on the sidelines of the Beijing Olympics put out by Putin and Xi Jinping, that they have an alliance that, as they say, is unlike anything seen before, and that exceeds or not an alliance, excuse me, a partnership that exceeds an alliance in its effectiveness and closeness. And so I don't think I think that if we see real progress here between the Russians and the Americans, then I don't know how that'll bode for the Asia pivot, because I would imagine that Putin would feel at some point that he could do what Xi Jinping has done for him in some sense, which is just offering support and showing that there is unity here and that they're looking out for each other's core interests. So we're definitely in uncharted territory, but I think there's no reason to be I'm more optimistic at this point, though, than pessimistic. I think that especially the American people are seeing that the February 16th thing was a big mistake. And the main propaganda point they have now is that if there is an escalation in the Donbas, they can blame it on Russia with all this false flag rhetoric. But even that is falling really, really flat. And if it doesn't happen, I don't think the Ukrainians, at least, Zelensky doesn't have an interest, I don't think, in starting a war. But that doesn't mean that some of the forces, they've got like 120,000 forces near the contact line, and most of them, as Lavrov, Sergey Lavrov has said, they're not under their control. So, somebody could do something and it could cause a real conflict, and that might be exactly what NATO wants. It's probably exactly what Victoria Nuland and Jake Sullivan want. But I think that it's looking like there is a possibility here. And also the Russians just saying, like, no, we're not going to recognize the Lufthansa People's Republic and the Donbas People's Republic, and we're going to pursue a real implementation of Minsk. And even Blinken putting out that warning. Putin already said that he wasn't going to do that. And so it's looking to me like we are, for the most part, heading toward a reduction in tensions. But I mean, obviously that could always change, especially when Stoltenberg and Austin are talking about, bolstering forces in all these areas especially on the Black Sea, which is, really a major part of what precipitated this crisis in the first place, is that they did that, and then Putin called their bluff here, and now we've gotten to a point where I just don't think that NATO can they can't do their usual thing where they just threaten the Russians and see how far they can push it and sell weapons and go on to the next year and run all the same drills or more again the next year. I think that the era of that is all coming to an end, which I think is probably certainly a very good thing.
All right, Connor, let's talk about Iran now, where it looks like the current round of talks has at least some positive direction, and maybe this could go well.
Yeah. So at Al Jazeera, there's a report that says Iran says the outcome of Vienna talks hinges on Western decisions. So we had Hussein Amir Abdollahian, the Iranian foreign minister, say that essentially that an agreement can be reached here very soon, but it hinges on, and he specifically says, the Americans and the E3, the Germans, the French, and the British, making political decisions. And so he says it's better and now, of course, we've been hearing for, quite a while now that the Americans go, well, the Iranians should realize that time is running out, and they're going to have to make some tough decisions. But he goes, it's better for Iran if there's an agreement in Vienna and sanctions are lifted today rather than tomorrow. He says, so we are in a hurry for a good agreement, but it must be within the framework of logical talks and to achieve the rights of the Iranian nation. Let's see. So he also called on the U.S. and the Europeans to stop playing with the text and time of the agreement and show some political will. We had the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council on Twitter say that there really is no need for speculation, that the decision can be unveiled at this moment. He says Vienna talks have reached a stage where outcome can be announced without speculation and with certainty. The U.S. political decision to realize or refuse to accept the requirements of a credible and lasting deal based on the principles accepted in the JCPOA can replace speculation. And so his name is Ali Shamkhani, and he also held a call with Ali Bagheri Khani, who's the lead negotiator in Vienna for Iran, and he said it reinforced his view because Khani told him that the Iranian team faces a tough challenge in sticking to the agenda because the Western parties continue to make a show of political will to evade their commitments. And Wang Quan, China's top negotiator there, has confirmed that Iran has submitted its final package, its final proposals to the Americans in response to a previous Western package, and he has called this the final stage of talks. The Russian chief negotiator Mikhail Ulyanov said in a tweet Sunday that all assessments were positive following his meetings with the U.S., European, and Chinese representatives without Iran. Now, so Amir Abdollahian also said, as reported here at antiwar.com, that a nuclear deal can be reached soon if the U.S. and the Europeans are serious about the negotiations. He says, we believe that if the American side and the three European countries are serious about returning to full implementation of their commitments, as per the JCPOA, achieving a good agreement will be possible in the short term. But we also have a report from Reuters where Ali Shamkhani, again, the secretary of the Iran Supreme National Security Council, sounded more pessimistic. So he says it's becoming more difficult and that the Western countries are pretending to come up with initiatives. It says, quote, the work of Iranian negotiators toward progress is becoming more difficult every moment while Western parties pretend to come up with initiatives to avoid their commitments. And they note here that although Ulyanov said that as well, that significant progress, apparently hours earlier, said significant progress has been made in the course of negotiations, Sergey Lavrov sounds actually pretty pessimistic. He says there's still a long way to go before the 2015 deal can be revived. Now, there's also a very good write-up here from Paul Pillar at Responsible Statecraft, and he's really talking about the uptick in sort of these the all the propaganda about, oh, Iran's breakout time has been reduced and they're only a month or two away from having enough fissile material for a bomb, and how this is being used. I believe that there was just another briefing to the Senate intelligence officials about this as well, where they cited that same number, and Jason Ditz debunked it at antiwar.com. But yeah, so I mean, this is being used quite a bit now, and it's being played up as a reason why you can't return to the deal. But Pilar makes the point, of course, that it's not as simple as like, oh, so here's the breakout time, and everybody thinks that like it'll just take them 60 days to get a bomb. You have to turn all that fissile material. First of all, none of it is enriched to weapons grade, first of all, and there's no indication that they intend to do that. In fact, they said that they will never enrich beyond 60%. Their nuclear chief said that earlier during the negotiations in the last couple of months. And that's the CIA's assessment as well, that they have no intention of building a bomb and that there's no evidence that they are. And that really flew in the face of the Israeli propaganda at the onset, which was that they were, in fact, racing toward a bomb. They said that almost immediately when the talks, like the day of or the day after or the day before that the talks began at the end of November. So, but he makes the point that you have to turn that enriched uranium not only in the weapons grade, it has to be turned into metal core, and then you have to obviously build the delivery vehicle, and all of that would take, it's a much longer process. And then, of course, as everybody knows, they have to test it. And if you test your first bomb and you use up everything you have, then everybody knows you know how to do it, but now you got to go back through the process. And all these things are not really, an issue so long as you have. First of all, I mean, I'm full disclosure. Iran's not going for a bomb. There's no evidence that they ever were. But for the sake of argument, then the argument of the Hawks that we can't return to the deal because of the breakout time reduction and the knowledge acquired by the nuclear scientists in Iran, that they say that, well, now if Biden returns to the deal because of Trump, it's going to be worse than the original JCPOA, and so even they will say that the breakout time goes down from when the deal was signed. So basically, the idea is that before the deal was signed in 2015. That their breakout time when they ramped up their nuclear program was estimated to be somewhere like 3 months. And now they're saying that it's after all the advancements they've made with the advanced centrifuges and obviously they always point to the stockpile of enriched uranium, but that's, as you've pointed out, the reason they would ship it out or blend it down. They can't export that because of the American sanctions. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But again, it's not weapons grade, and the idea is that they have these advanced centrifuges and they have this stockpile and that they've enriched to 60%. And they'll say, well, this is close to weapons grade. But the truth is, how do we know all this stuff? Because the well, first of all, because the Iranians have been upfront about it, had this, and it was used as leverage, particularly like the 60% enrichment, the 20% enrichment at the Tehran Medical Research Reactor. These measures were all followed either the Israeli assassination of Fakhrizadeh, the Iranian scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh at the end of the Trump administration, or when talks began initially still under the Rouhani government in April, the Israelis attacked the Natanz uranium enrichment. They attacked the Natanz facility, which is their main center for building centrifuges, and attack ships, Iranian ships as well at sea. So this. I mean, it's dishonest, obviously, but the point is that logically, the argument that if we don't return to the deal, then or if you do return to the deal, there's this issue because the breakout time is now 6 months. Although they argue now that in this current situation, the breakout time is only like 1 to 2 months. So their argument is that we should stay out of the deal, which makes no sense because, of course, as I said, or as I was getting to, this is the most intrusive and comprehensive inspections regime in the history of the world. So if they even made these moves that supposedly that they're going to all of a sudden they're going to start racing to a bomb, and there's like it's maybe in 2 months or whatever, let's say, grant them that the because of the inspections, the Western parties and the UN and the IAEA would know all about this instantly. So the idea that removing the inspections or just forcing them out of the deal by continuing to isolate them and adding more sanctions and continuing at this point Biden's maximum pressure campaign is completely contradictory to their stated aims. It's akin to Israel saying that they, the argument that don't return to the JCPOA, they're gonna it's their path to a bomb. They're enriching uranium. Look at all this. When of course, as Dave DeCamp always points out, under the deal they would reduce it to 3.67% enrichment for the uranium and come back to under all the restrictions in the written JCPOA. And so obviously, Israel is not actually out to defend themselves against a non-existent Iranian nuclear threat. In fact, that was admitted so much in the report in Axios about Bennett's recent call with Biden, where he told him, "Don't return to the deal because Iran's not a nuclear threat anyway, with or without sanctions." He goes, "They're not going to increase. They're not going to advance their nuclear program one way or the other." And like anybody who was, reading all this stuff anywhere or listening to our show would have known that because the Iranians announced that months ago. So, but it also does show the duplicity of the Israeli position, which is that they know damn well that that this is not a legitimate threat, and this is about maintaining their position in the status quo in the region. And I think it's one of the reasons why they continue to bolster their alliances with states like Bahrain. But before I move on from the Pilar article, I really like this quote he has. Where he says, Tehran's signing of the JCPOA is utterly incomprehensible, except in the context of a strategic decision by Iran that it would be better off as a non-nuclear weapon state that gets relief from economic sanctions and is integrated into the world community than to be a sanctioned and isolated nuclear pariah. Iran's extensive dismantling of its nuclear program under the JCPOA would make no sense under any other interpretation. And then he does talk about how if they stay the course and continue and renew these military threats, then it does push Iran, even though they have said, in fact, both Ayatollahs have said they will never, pursue chemical weapons or nuclear weapons. It doesn't mean that that's always going to be true. And if they are really threatened, it's a new regime, or, there may come a time where they do feel that it's necessary to seek out a bomb, if only for their, for the survival of their country. So, and also Trita Parsi mentioned months ago on the Scott Horton show that it's possible that beyond goading Iran out of the JCPOA, that the real hawks here could be also trying to goad them out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Because even if they were no longer in the JCPOA, which if Biden maintains the current policy and they're just going to basically go, well, we tried, and then just, reimpose sanctions or excuse me, add more sanctions and continue this awful policy, then it's conceivable that they could just say, well, then screw it. We won't do we won't, be subject to these inspections anymore. We're leaving the deal too. And they could always, move, east and do more business with China and Russia and Venezuela and these countries that are also targets of Washington and sanctions, et cetera. But they also could be trying to force them out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the truth is that if they didn't have the JCPOA, they wouldn't have the double, triple, quadruple, extra confirmation that they are not seeking nuclear weapons. But it would also still be under the Safeguards Agreement and the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So, but if they do go them out of that could cause a real crisis. And that's what I think is the thing to be most worried about if they continue the way they are. But at the same time, Bagheri Khani, the leading negotiator, said today on Twitter that they're closer than ever to a deal. Says the other side just has to make a decision. He says, after weeks of intensive talks, we are closer than ever to an agreement. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, though. Our negotiating partners need to be realistic and avoid intransigence and heed the lessons of the past 4 years. This is the time for serious decisions. And Ned Price said that the talks are entering a decisive period. He says in the coming days, the U.S. will know if Iran is serious about reviving the deal. And then the French foreign minister came out and said It is not a question of weeks. It is a question of days. Iran has to let's see. He says they have a very clear choice, meaning Iran. Either they unleash a serious crisis in the next days, or they accept an agreement that respects the interests of all parties. And I'll just point out that, like, I mean, obviously the big elephant in the room is Congress, who are not going to allow this deal to go through. All the Republicans are against it for all intents and for all intents and purposes. You know, Ted Cruz and I think 30 other senators put out this. They've already pushed this letter and saying that they're going to use every tool at their disposal to subvert a return to the JCPOA. And but the Iranian foreign minister has issued a call to Congress to express their support for the JCPOA. Now, that's not likely to happen, but obviously, I mean, that's obviously the real problem here too, especially. Now, as far as Israel goes, Lindsey Graham was just in Jerusalem speaking with Israeli officials, Benny Gantz, Yair Lapid, the foreign minister, and Naftali Bennett. And he went on an unhinged rant about how that Iran is a greater threat than even Russia and China. They're like the Nazis. They're bent on a second Holocaust, that they want to make the whole world submit to their religion. He says the Nazis wanted a master race. The Iranians want a master religion. People like this cannot be ignored. He says if Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, it could cause an arms race in the region. This is the line we usually hear from the Israelis, actually. And he says, Israel won't be able to live with a nuclear Iran. I guarantee you the Jewish people can't live that way. One Holocaust was enough. There will be war. Why can't Iran have nuclear weapons? Because Israelis say never again. Now, he also talked about, he said that he raised the idea of a mutual defense treaty with Israel to send a message to the world that, quote, the destruction of the Jewish state means war with the United States. Now, as Dave DeCamp points out here at antiwar.com, that Benny Gantz opposed this idea last year because he thought it would restrict Israel's ability to act against its neighbors. But Graham qualified and said he would never suggest that any defense agreement would restrict Israel's ability to act on their own. Now, this is also an indication to me. You could take this a couple of different ways. But I think it indicates that Israel is very nervous about how close we are to returning to the JCPOA. So they've sent diplomats to Vienna, a delegation of diplomats to meet with negotiators from all the different countries there, except for the Iranians, of course. Now, apparently they met with Mikhail Ulyanov, the Russian envoy, and as well as Rafael Grossi, the head of the IAEA. Ulyanov said that he discussed IAEA-related issues with the Israelis, and they plan to meet, according to the Jerusalem Post, they plan to meet with, like I said, everybody involved in the talks. So, and now in Bahrain, Naftali Bennett just visited the country and was greeted by, let's see, the king and his son, and at the airport. And he made this is largely about, you know, building up economic cooperation and tourism and you know, enhancing security and all this kind of stuff about, you know, we're close partners now. But it was mostly building up and expanding this regional alliance against Iran. Bahrain is outwardly against a return to the JCPOA. I think it's a little bit more ambiguous with Saudi Arabia. I think they've made some statements that indicate that they're kind of okay with it. And especially, of course, because the UAE and Saudi Arabia, as we've been covering, have been making, and Tehran too. I mean, obviously, especially after the Baghdad brokered talks, there have been a lot of warming of ties. I mean, they're literally the Saudis and the Iranians are talking about reopening and establishing normal, you know, their consulates and their embassies and reestablishing normal diplomatic relations. And they've resumed trade. You know, Iran sends exports to Saudi Arabia, et cetera. So, and the UAE was talking about doing the same thing, but Israel jumped on that immediately and tried to subvert it and said it was unacceptable that would ever happen. That the UAE would warm ties with Tehran. This is after they sent their national security advisor to Iran. Now, Bennett says that Israel and Bahrain deal with great security challenges that stem from the same source, Iran. And he says Israel fights Iran and its proxies every day, and we will help our friends in the region. Now, of course, this is right after Gantz earlier this month signed a military pact with Bahrain and visited the country. And they're going to be increasing intelligence cooperation, joint military exercises, procurement, and most notably, they're going to be stationing a naval officer in Bahrain, making it the first Arab country to host an Israeli military official. And supposedly, there's a report. I mean, the way it's in Al Jazeera, they talk about this this Israeli naval officer. There's media reports that are saying that he's been appointed in Bahrain to serve as a liaison for the U.S. Fifth Fleet. And then a state news agency reported that what has been circulated in some foreign media about the appointment of an Israeli officer is part of arrangements related to an international coalition that includes more than 34 countries. It says the coalition seeks to secure freedom of navigation in territorial waters, protect international trade, and confront acts of piracy and terrorism in the region, which is ironic because in many cases you have obviously the Americans and the Israelis attacking Iranian ships, and the Israelis obviously attacking oil tankers, and especially when they're trying to deliver oil to Syria. We also have, again, continuing with this sort of Israeli involvement with CENTCOM and with these Abraham's Accords countries in this anti-Iran alliance, I thought it was important to note that, they're clearly, it seems to me, the Israelis are exploiting the escalations in Yemen as well as the retaliatory strikes on oil facilities in the UAE as a way of kind of hitting the brake, or attempting to, first of all, to prevent America from returning to the JCPOA. That was one of the things that they did immediately. They said that in Vienna they should talk about their support for proxies and these terrorists all over the region that are causing all these problems. And of course, we've discussed before that it's not fair to say that the Houthis an Iranian proxy, or even that they're providing them all military support. There's not much evidence there, and of course the country's been under blockade. But now even Biden's new nominee for I should add that Israel is also talking about, selling the Iron Dome technology to the UAE. They immediately after the attack from the Houthis on the UAE oil facilities, they offered security and intelligence cooperation with the United Arab Emirates. They have, obviously the Americans sent the F-22s, a squadron of F-22s in the USS Cole, and we're seeing, I think that this is, they were very concerned when the UAE and Iran started making peace overtures. And also I think that as indicates that even the UAE, as well as the Saudis relationship, their improving relationship with the Iranians, indicates that they know that this stuff about the Houthis being an Iranian proxy is mostly nonsense. And so Israel, it says here in this report from Dave DeCamp that Israel is looking to bolster the UAE's missile defenses, and they're reportedly considering selling Abu Dhabi the Iron Dome, like I said. But on Tuesday, this was earlier this month, Lieutenant General Michael Kurilla, who is nominated to be replacing McKenzie as commander of Central Command, he says that Israel's cooperation with the UAE and these other Gulf nations in missile defense is promising. He says that's probably the area with some of the greatest opportunity working toward an integrated air and missile defense. I think the addition of Israel will help that. Now, Israel is now also reportedly lobbying to get the Houthis designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the U.S. According to the Times of Israel, the UAE requested their help. And in the report, an Israeli official portrays the Houthis as an Iranian proxy, and they said that the designation would curb Iran's reckless influence in the region. He says, we're not only doing this for the Emiratis, we believe such a step is in everyone's interest. And probably the worst provocation. Well, I should add that also, we've seen these naval-led, this recent large-scale naval, U.S.-led naval drill that included Saudi Arabia and Oman and Israel as well, which is the first time that Israel ever drilled with these countries. And on top of that, now, this week, we had Israeli F-15 fighter jets escorting an American B-52H, nuclear-capable B-52H Stratofortress, accompanied by 2 additional American fighter jets. From Israeli airspace to the Persian Gulf. Apparently, it made a round. The B-52s. These were initially sent to the UK, and it was kind of painted as a sort of a sign to Russia of like we're putting more military assets in the region and this kind of thing. But now they've sent it to the Persian Gulf. Now, the IDF in a statement said that the flight was held as part of close cooperation with the U.S. military, which represents a significant element in ensuring the security of the state of Israel's airspace and the Middle East. But the U.S. military said the flight was meant to demonstrate U.S. Air Force's ability to seamlessly operate across combatant commands. Anyway, this is the kind of the thing that we saw, especially at the end of Trump's administration. It seemed like every couple of weeks, the Americans were flying B-52s over the Persian Gulf, and we saw escalations of particularly Israeli submarines getting closer to Iran, and we were sending more and more military forces to Saudi Arabia, and obviously they were adding sanctions every week as well. It actually did look at the end of Trump's administration like it was conceivable that they could start a war on the way out before Biden took office, because putatively, Biden was going to surely return to the JCPOA when he became president. That obviously hasn't happened. But the fact that they're sending these B-52s again, which I believe Biden did as well, not as often, but it very early on in his administration. The fact that they're returning to this is obviously not a very good sign, especially as we're getting closer and closer to, as they're all saying, the final stages of negotiations.
All right, Connor. Any more on the Iran stuff?
That's mostly what I have today. It does, like I said, it does appear that the Americans are coming out and saying that we're getting closer and closer to a deal, a decisive period. But it's honestly, these statements are usually vague, but you kind of have to look at what they're all saying. I think the Russians seem a little conflicted, especially considering that Ulyanov seems very optimistic, but Lavrov is saying that we're nowhere near a real agreement. And it's very. I think that. For instance, Chris Murphy is coming out and arguing in favor of returning to the deal. This is the senator from Connecticut, and he's saying he's kind of hyping up. He's kind of using the Hawks arguments to promote a return to the JCPOA. So he's talking about, he'll say like, look, Trump, we've tried your policy, Iran Hawks. We left the JCPOA, and look at what has happened in the last 4 years. And he talks about the nuclear advancements. He blames Iran, I think, unfairly for attacks on U.S. troops and bases in Iraq and Syria. I think especially after Trump's assassination of Soleimani, it's not fair to characterize these groups as acting at the behest of Iran. And the Iranians have, repeatedly, it's not inconceivable that they could be agitating this sort of thing. But for the most part, the Iranians, it's been known that they've been trying to stress to these groups, these militias that are increasingly no longer under their control, to, reduce tensions and not provoke the Americans, because obviously they're in the midst of these negotiations with to try to return to the JCPOA, and that's the main interest here. But he points out that he goes, newsflash, actually there are times when diplomatic agreements with other countries that you may not like are actually in the best interest of the United States, and returning to the JCPOA is certainly one of them. But like I said, he talks about how they've ramped up enrichment, and he talks about the nuclear stockpile, and he says that look at what he talks about the Houthis again, like they're Iranian cat's paws or something. And so, like I said, he's granting the Hawks their arguments, but using them to try and encourage a return to the JCPOA. And he blames Trump for the situation we're in today, which is, as we've talked about before, that seems to be the Biden administration's policy. So if more Democrats can do that, I don't like granting the Hawks all this rhetorical credit, all of their lies basically. But if that becomes what is politically necessary in order to return to the JCPOA, then that's not necessarily a bad thing, because they could also be showing Biden some support that, like, hey, you're not alone here in trying to return to this deal. Because quite honestly, I haven't seen hardly any prominent Democrats push for a return to the JCPOA, and quite the contrary, Bob Menendez, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, has been absolutely horrible on this issue, and has been saying to they should put more sanctions on and enforce them more rigidly and all this other stuff and ramp up the maximum pressure. So, like I said, I think Congress is the main problem here. That's what it really comes down to, and the Iranians know that. And I think all the parties involved realize that, which is why they always say to the Americans, "You're gonna have to make some political decisions," because they want the Iranians to take this kind of bad deal, which is basically they know the treaty. If it is a treaty, that they won't get support from the Congress, and also they know that if they return to the JCPOA as is, their sanctions relief is very limited. You don't know how long it's going to take for the benefits to be reaped, or how long it'll take to lift sanctions. And of course, if the Republicans take office, they're going to rip the thing up anyway. So, I mean, it's there. Everybody's here between a rock and a hard place, except of course the Americans and the Europeans. And I feel like the Europeans are just going to do whatever the Americans tell them to do. It's sort of appeared that way, and it's kind of epitomized in those hawkish statements by the French foreign minister. So in many ways, we seem to be getting closer to a deal, but at the same time, the words are changing, but the rhetoric over the last couple of months is still largely the same. I will say, I think that, they really did make some significant changes in that seventh round of negotiations, because they really are here at the end stage. It does appear that way, because they can't drag this out that much further. That's why the Iranians are saying, look, there's no need for speculation. Just tell us what your decision is, because everything seems to have been put on the table. But the Hawks have no leg to stand on with their arguments, but it doesn't mean that they won't still keep the policy. And I think, as I said, the Abrahams Accord caucus and all this kind of concurrent congressional support for these Trumpian policies indicates that there is a major, multifaceted move to kind of maintain the status quo. And the Americans are talking, Brett McGurk at the National Security Council is talking about this back to basics approach, which is why we're seeing more weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, to Jordan, to the UAE, and all this, talk, like I said, from CENTCOM, and getting more directly involved in the war in Yemen. And again, I don't think it's accidental that when the UAE when the Houthis took another shot at the UAE, this is one of the strikes that was intercepted. It was when Herzog. It was when Isaac Herzog, the Israeli president, was visiting, and this was shortly after, because it was very obvious what was going on. And I mean, Israel, if they are going to get more involved in this, like the Americans are, it's not inconceivable that they could become increasingly involved in the conflict with Yemen. So, all this is just going nowhere good. But I see this as a real step back, because people thought Biden was moving away from the status quo in the Middle East and pivoting towards Asia, which is not good. Obviously, that's horrible. But they just seem to be committed to remaining overstretched and maintaining these alliances or these partnerships as an end to themselves.
All right, Connor, that's where we'll wrap up the show for today. Thank you so much for coming back on and being the co-host today. Connor is Freeman's Mind 96 on Twitter. Follow the show, share the show, and keep your eye out on the Institute for all the great work that me and Connor have coming out. Thanks, Connor.
Thanks, Kyle.